How far down the legs is it? There's a many skirts. Is it above the knees?
It's above the knees, I think, yeah. Or
Yes, it's okay.
Yeah.
For-
But for guys, it's okay, I suppose.
There's a many skirts. Is it above the knees?
Okay. So what we were looking at yesterday is that we noticed that the sequence of the Parshios of Shema is first accepting the yoke of heaven, then accepting the yoke of mitzvot, and then speaking about Yitzias Mitzrayim and the Parsha of Tzitzis, because that's the least priority, because the mitzvah of Tzitzis only applies during the day, but not at night. And then the Gemara had brought this discussion of putting on tefillin. Do you put on the tefillin before the Shema, or do you put on tefillin after the Shema? And the Brisa seems, the Gemara here seems, it quotes a Brisa that says you're supposed to put on the tefillin before the Shema. But then it says that Rav did not, that Rav would put on, I'm sorry, it was Rabbi Yochanan would put on the tefillin before the Shema because he wanted to accept the yoke of heaven with his tefillin on. But Rav would put his tefillin on after Shema. And the Gemara had said that that's consistent with the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says, accept the yoke of heaven, and then accept the yoke of mitzvot. And tefillin represents the yoke of mitzvot. Why then are we makbid to put on the tefillin before the Shema? So this is where the Bavli and the Yerushalmi diverge a little bit. This is something I saw in the notes. The Bavli is of the opinion that everyone agrees that you have to always put on the tefillin, even though it has to do with accepting doing the mitzvahs. That's really what tefillin is all about. I'm binding myself to perform, to serve God, right? But there's a fundamental difference between verbally committing myself to do mitzvahs and doing the act of binding the tefillin to my body. Okay, so the act of binding my tefillin to my body is not a verbal commitment. It's a physical act. And that's the reason why it has to precede the recital of Shema. And there's a second reason that it has to precede the recital of Shema, which is because in the first paragraph of Shema, it says, Ukshartam la'os al yodecha v'hayu l'totafos beinenecha. There's a commandment to bind the tefillin. So in order for a person not to look like a liar, that he's reciting that first paragraph of Shema without tefillin, the rabbi said you should always have your tefillin on before you recite even the first paragraph of Shema. Why is it that Rav only put on the tefillin after? So the Bavli says, we don't find this in Yerushalmi, but the Bavli says that was a unique circumstance that he didn't have tefillin, and he sent someone to get his tefillin, and by the time the guy came back, he had already finished the first paragraph of Shema. So he put on the tefillin afterwards in order to daven the Amidah with his tefillin. So just keep in mind that we can't infer halacha. The halacha from this section of the Yerushalmi, the halacha really is like the Bavli, that you're really supposed to have your tefillin on when you say the Shema.
I mean, it's funny, Yerushalmi, like, they lived in Eretz Yisrael, probably didn't come till after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Where's the Masorah?
Well, the Yerushalmi is also after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash.
No, but they lived in Eretz Yisrael. They had a Masorah from the time of the Beis Hamikdash. Like,
yeah, the Masorah didn't change though, just because they traveled to Iraq.
Because that's what I'm saying. So they have a Masorah from in Eretz Yisrael, and then all of a sudden destruction comes and they're taken over to Babel.
So look, the destruction is in 70 of the Common Era.
Right. So
the Yerushalmi is written about 200 years before, 150 years before the Bavli, but it's in the year 300, something like that.
Right. So, but wasn't there we had a Masorah for 700-800, like from the time?
Yeah, but there were many things that we didn't have a Masorah for. Some of it could have been forgotten, but there were other things that just hadn't been formulated yet. Remember, a lot of the formal religious practice was not formulated until the times of the Gemara, until post-temple. In general, what we find is when the temple is standing a lot more latitude is given to people in how they do the mitzvahs. There's much less codification. Because when you're in the palace of the king, you know yourself how you're supposed to behave. Once you leave the king's palace, we need to give you very specific instructions as to what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do.
So it's same like with Rabbeinu Tam and Rashi, all of a sudden in the 10th or 11th century, we don't know which.
Yeah,
parsha should
the
be
order
tefillin.
of the
Right,
parshas, right?
What happened for like thousands of years before
Right.
that?
Yeah, so
Well,
like people ask, why don't they just find a
Pair of tefillin
a pair of tefillin from the first century and check it and find out? I don't think we have a copy of it. And but
again, so the question, what was the Musar? All of a sudden, they just didn't know what the order of the
right,
parshas were.
yeah, it could be
1,000 years
yeah,
ago.
it could be they didn't have it because it was never discussed. It just wasn't discussed, or maybe there wasn't a kapeda as far as what the order should be. Like I get questions sometimes. Or let me give you an example. Okay. I remember when I was a much younger father, one of our kids had ear surgery, the tubes or whatever it was. And the doctor said, put in a few drops every, few hours. Well, I said, how many is a few? Is it 3 or is it 30? And I wasn't trying to be smart with the guy, but I wanted to know, like you're telling me to put drops in my kids' ears. I need to know exactly how many drops, right? So the doctor's attitude was, probably doesn't matter whether you put in 3 or 30, as long as you're lubricating the area. And he probably figured that most people would say a few is like probably between like 3 and 7 or 8, right? That's a few. And it doesn't really matter. But when you're a patient, and so you need to know, you want to know exactly, right? So in medicine, sometimes the specificity is not for the sake of the medicine, it's for the sake of the well-being of the mental well-being of the patient, right? Can you relate to that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, and I think that in many aspects of halacha, the Rambam actually writes this in a much broader sense, but we're getting too far afield. But the Rambam does say this concept that the details of certain mitzvos really were designated just so that there could be uniformity of practice within Am Yisrael. In other words, there's
an interesting statement.
It's a very bold statement. In other words, yeah, Hashem wants us to shecht our animals, but the Rambam demonstrates from a medrash that God really doesn't care whether it's shechted from this part of the neck or that part of the neck, as long as you shecht it. But there needed to be uniformity of practice. Otherwise, people would be too loosey-goosey. So Hashem said, when you shecht it, you got to shecht it in a certain way. It's even more so when you get into rabbinic law. In rabbinic law, part of the function of the rabbis is to provide a sense of structure in people's lives. If we give too much latitude, this could have a number of negative ramifications. There will be too many divergences, and sense of community will start to break apart. But also psychologically, people need to know, people want to have that comfort knowing I'm doing the right thing. Okay? Okay.
I just think like, what does Sudja Gaon do? What all the high Gaon, like they were not so far before that. And what did they wear?
Right.
Right. Let's say.
Okay. Good. So now that we're talking about putting on your tefillin, Amar Rebbe Yana, we're going to have a few lines of discussion about wearing tefillin. So Amar Rebbe Yana, tefillin srichin guf naki. That tefillin needs a clean body. Now, what does that mean? It needs. It's on Chafamid Beis, and it's Amar Rebbe Yana, the bottom quarter. Amar Rebbe Yana, tefillin srichin guf naki. Tefillin needs a clean body, which means that when you wear your tefillin, you have to be careful that you're not going to defecate or even flatulate while you're wearing your tefillin. That's why, by the way, there's a halacha that women are not supposed to wear tefillin. even though women are permitted technically to wear tzitzis, they're not permitted to wear tefillin. Why? Because anyone who's not obligated to wear tefillin, and it's also one of those mitzvahs, aseh shazman grum, it's a time-bound mitzvah. If you're not obligated, then you shouldn't, because we're concerned maybe you'll doze off and you'll be flatulent in your tefillin, and that will be a desecration of the tefillin.
But even here, like, it's like you were saying before, when you lived it, you knew maybe what naki means. The codification of naki, what does it mean, right? Exactly? What does reasonable mean? What does kavana mean?
That's right.
They lived it, right? So
they lived it.
They didn't know until later they codified it. What does naki mean?
Exactly. Now, mipnei malo hechaziku bahen. So why is it that if that's the case, says the Gemara, and this is just one way of understanding this line. There's the machlokas how to understand this line. Mipnei malo hechaziku bahen. Why, when people would wear their tefillin for the entire day, why didn't people assume that these were holy people? In other words, a guy who would wear his tefillin the whole day, he must have been really focused and intensely made sure that he would be very careful with everything that he did. If so, he probably is a holy guy. So why is it that people, when they would see people wearing tefillin the whole day, why didn't they assume that they were very, very devout people? Mipnei haramoyin. And the Gemara answers because they were people who would wear tefillin the whole day and were not so holy. And they only wore tefillin the whole day so that they should look holy. And that's a very important thing you got to look out for.
So the same thing as a black hat?
Yeah, sort of. Well, whatever you want to call it, the long beard, the payas, anything that, is the external appearance. You can't always judge a book by its cover.
But didn't they always used to wear it and they stopped at a certain time in history?
There used to be a period when people would wear tefillin all day, but even then, not everyone did it. Only the pious people did it. And that's why the Gemara is saying, to wear tefillin the whole day, you have to maintain a certain amount of focus that you're not going to do anything that is going to desecrate the tefillin. So then why didn't they maintain that those people are holy? And the answer is, and as we'll see it let's take a look at this story. Uvda hava bechad barnash. There was once a story about a guy, da'afkid gabe chabre, who left his money, who left cash by a friend of his who used to wear tefillin the whole day, because he figured this guy's a holy yid, okay? The kafar bay. But then when he came back to get his money, the guy said, I don't have your money. What are you talking about? Amar le lo lach himnis, ela leilein de bereshach himnis. And the guy pointed to his tefillin and he said, I didn't trust you because of you. I trusted you because of your tefillin. How dare you wear tefillin like that and then lie to my face and tell me that I don't owe you the money. Times haven't changed that much, huh? Right? So actually in footnote 19, it brings the postscript to the story from a psikta midrash, from a medrash. And it says that this guy who was owed the money, he went, wrapped himself in his talis and tefillin, and prayed to Hashem. Ribono shel olam lo hemanti ela l'shimcha hakadosh shehaya al rosho. Hashem, I only trusted this man because of your holy name that was on his head. So I need your help, Ribono shel olam. And Hashem, the guy then, after he finished, he nodded off and dozed off, and he had a dream of Eliyahu Hanavi. And Eliyahu Hanavi told him, go to this man's wife and tell him that you have divine information, that you know that they ate chametz on Pesach and they ate on Yom Kippur. So the guy went to the wife and said, I have inside information. Not only do you have my money, but you also ate chametz on Pesach and you ate on Yom Kippur. And she was so frightened by the guy that she gave him the money. And the husband came and he started whacking her. And he says, now everyone will know that we've gone back to our old ways, because they were Balei Tshuva, or they were converts. It's not clear. And so they left Yiddishkeit entirely. So that was the end of the story. What a bizarre story. Yeah. Okay, but it's really quite interesting that what the Gemara is basically saying is something that we all intuitively know from our own experiences. Don't judge a book by its cover. Okay, we'll have to hold it here. We'll continue Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Okay, have a great day, everybody, and a meaningful time.